If you step back and look at the American political landscape, say, over the last decade, it feels less like a steady rhythm and more like I don't know, a heart attack.
Right.
We used to have this seemingly predictable political metronome. 8 years of one party, the voters would get tired, and then we'd swing into 8 years of the other.
You could almost plan around it.
You could. It was a cycle.
It was reliable, wasn't it?
Mm.
I mean, think about the handover from Reagan to Clinton or from Bush to Obama. There was a sense of order there, even with the policy shifts.
Mm.
But that traditional pattern, that 8-year cycle, it just completely dissolved.
Dissolved is the right word. It's not just broken. It feels, well, frantic.
Mm.
We went from Obama to Trump, which was this huge, dramatic rejection of the status quo.
Instantaneous.
And then just as fast, a sharp turn to Biden, and now the entire political conversation is just whipping back toward Trump again.
Yeah.
The speed is dizzying. It's almost manic.
And that rapid back and forth, that oscillation, is what our sources today are really focused on. Mainstream analysis often tries to simplify this.
Sure, they just call it polarization.
Exactly, polarization, or maybe, a bad case of incumbent fatigue. But the material we've been looking at argues that those explanations are, while they're superficial, they miss the structural cause that's running just beneath the surface.
And that structural cause, that's the core thesis for this deep dive, right?
It is.
The idea that the root of all this instability is the deep failure of a two-party duopoly. That, despite all the noise and the hostility, is actually operating under a kind of hidden cross-party consensus.
So our mission today is to really unpack that strange dynamic. We need to identify the dominant players inside this consensus, the neocons and the neoliberals.
Right.
Then we have to understand the mechanism they use to control dissent, what the source calls gamesmanship, and then finally analyze why this whole political illusion seems to be wearing thin for so many people.
And why that's causing this political whiplash. We're looking for the glitch in the machine.
That's it.
Okay, so let's start by grounding ourselves in that historical norm you mentioned, the predictable past. The stability of that 8-year tenure, that was key to the system feeling like it worked.
It was. The whole political machine was designed to absorb pressure slowly. Voter discontent would kind of simmer, it would build up over 2 terms, and then you'd get this orderly shift.
And even if the new party didn't fundamentally change the deep power structures, just the change of faces, the new rhetoric.
It gave the public enough time to feel heard, at least temporarily.
But the instability now is so different. The sources call it a glitching machine. It's not a slow swing anymore. It's a frantic whiplashing.
And that specific sequence of transitions, it just proves the point perfectly. The electorate didn't just reject Obama's successor, right? They rejected the entire establishment by putting in Trump. Then, when Trump's tenure didn't deliver the economic change a lot of people hoped for, the voters just instantly flipped to Biden. And now they're on the verge of flipping back again.
Okay, but I have to challenge that a little bit. If the electorate is firing the establishment wing of both parties every 4 years, almost before they unpack, why hasn't a real third party shown up?
That's a great question.
Doesn't the fact that it's still a duopoly, even a frantic one, prove that the consensus is still the only game in town?
And that is the critical point the sources are making. The machine is designed to ensure that the only options provided are the 2 wings of the same consensus.
So it channels the anger.
It's designed to absorb that dissent, to channel it into one of 2 acceptable levers. The instability, this frantic 4-year swing, that's just proof that voters are realizing faster than ever that pulling either lever gets them pretty much the same, for their material reality.
So the conflict we see on TV isn't a healthy rivalry.
No, it's a consensus disguised as a rivalry, and that's the core failure of the structure.
Okay, let's unpack this consensus itself then. Let's define these 2 factions that dominate the closed loop. The neocons and the neoliberals.
Right. And these 2 ideologies, they're not ancient rivals. They're basically the 2 dominant operating systems of the American establishment going back to the 90s. And even though they operate under different party banners, their foundational goals, well, they often align.
And that creates the loop.
That creates that powerful self-sustaining loop.
So let's start with the neocons. This is the group that really dominated the pre-Trump GOP, right? The Bush 43 administration is the classic example. What were their defining goals beyond, just cutting taxes?
The neocon playbook was, I mean, a pretty sophisticated blend of militarism and corporate fealty.
Yeah.
Externally, their signature was the aggressive projection of American military power.
Right. Interventionism.
Interventionism, regime change, ensuring global access to resources and markets. And this requires massive defense spending, which of course directly benefits a specific set of corporate interests back home.
The defense contractors, heavy industry.
Exactly. So the goal wasn't just about making the world safe. It was about making sure that military policy was also serving corporate profit.
And what about at home, internally?
Internally, the neocon agenda was deeply devoted to deregulation and fiscal policies that favored huge corporations and global capital. So think of the intense lobbying for lower corporate tax rates, less environmental oversight, basically making the domestic environment as friendly as possible for big business.
And all of this is justified under the banner of what? Free market efficiency.
Free market efficiency and strength, yeah.
Okay, so then we pivot to the Democratic side and the neoliberal dominance that's been in place since, what, the Clinton era. Their focus seems, at least on the surface, totally different.
On the surface, yes. The neoliberal strategy was to champion globalized free trade and to do it aggressively. This meant supporting agreements like NAFTA, enabling China's entry into the WTO.
Moves that integrated America into a global supply chain.
Right, which was a huge win for multinational corporations, but, as we saw, pretty devastating for domestic manufacturing wages. And they paired this with intense financial deregulation.
Can you give us a concrete example of that? Because financial deregulation is one of those phrases that can just fly over people's heads.
Sure. I think that the key move was the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999. It basically blurred the lines between commercial banks and investment banks. And this fueled the growth of these massive interconnected financial institutions that were too big to fail, which was, hugely profitable for Wall Street. And while neoliberals were championing these policies, they would simultaneously focus on progressive social liberalism.
And that was the visible distinction.
That was the visible rhetorical distinction from the Republicans. It effectively masked the deep economic alignment they shared with the corporate right.
And this is where the source's core insight really comes into focus and where it gets, I think, really interesting. Because the political theater, the day-to-day fighting, it suggests they're existential enemies.
Oh, absolutely.
They fight ferociously over cultural issues. They wear different colored jerseys. But what happens when you actually map out their policies on the foundational stuff?
The profound insight is that the culture wars are the necessary political theater. They're a distraction from the alignment on actual policy.
So when you look at war, Wall Street, and the corporate structure of the economy.
The Venn diagram is, as the source puts it, nearly a circle. They both rely on a debt-driven, financially engineered economy that rewards, rent seekers over actual workers.
Give us some concrete examples of that overlap. Where do the neocons and neoliberals stop fighting and start, governing together?
Okay, look at the biggest decisions of the last 20 years. The vast majority of the neoliberal wing supported the massive financial bailouts in 2008.
Just like their neocon counterpart.
Just like them. And when it comes to global military intervention or funding the massive defense budget, you rarely see serious resistance from either party, no matter who's in the White House.
And they both supported the trade agreements.
Both have historically supported trade agreements that accelerated the decline of labor power in the U.S. This policy uniformity on the biggest, most consequential decisions, who gets rich and who goes to war, that is the source of the duopoly's gamesmanship.
So the game is basically, we'll fight about identity issues and abortion rights, but we completely agree on protecting the financial structure and the permanent war economy.
Precisely.
And this uniformity ensures the real power structure never, ever changes.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you start to see how this duopoly functions not as a democracy offering genuine choice, but as a kind of sophisticated pressure valve.
A pressure valve. I like that.
Yeah.
So it implies the system is designed to vent public anger without ever letting that pressure actually damage the fundamental machinery.
It lets people feel like they're getting change by voting.
But only within a safe, contained structure. Okay, let's walk through the mechanics of that voter switch, of taking the bait.
Right. So the cycle begins when the neoliberals, the blue team, are in power. They successfully push their social agenda, but the underlying economic reality for most people gets worse.
Because of their financial policies.
Exactly. Rents skyrocket, healthcare costs are crushing, wages stagnate, and this creates this acute material voter anger.
So the system senses this anger, and what does it do? It offers the only other option it has: the red team, the neocons, or their populist successors.
And voters who are just desperate for any change to their material reality, they take the bait. They genuinely hope that the new rhetoric, fight for the forgotten man, drain the swamp, will actually fix things.
But here's the cruel twist in the mechanism. 4 years later, what do they realize?
Their material reality hasn't improved. And why? Because while the new party might have cut some regulations or changed the rhetoric on immigration, the core economic consensus
Wall Street's dominance, financialization, the trade deals.
hasn't changed one bit. The debt machine keeps running, and the cost of living is still unbearable.
And that instant disappointment is what triggers the switchback. They rush back to the other side, convinced that the other party must have the solution, even though its economic framework is basically the same.
And this back and forth, which is getting faster and faster, is the genius and the tragedy of this closed loop.
It guarantees that no matter who is in power, the fundamental corporate status quo, the financial interests at the very top, are maintained.
The pressure gets released safely by letting the electorate switch jerseys every 4 years, but the power structure itself is never touched. It's an elegant, if deeply cynical form of control.
Which makes the current volatility so much less mysterious. We can now connect the mechanism we just talked about back to that frantic instability we saw at the start of our deep dive.
Exactly. The source material argues that the reason the pendulum is swinging so frantically, firing Trump, firing Biden, and so on, is that the electorate is realizing the illusion is wearing thin, and they're realizing it much, much faster than they did 20 years ago.
Right. It used to take 8 years for voters to figure out that the neocon or neoliberal framework wasn't actually helping their family budget. Now they're seeing it within a single 4-year cycle.
They're seeing that the promised change from the establishment wing of either party is just cosmetic. The underlying conditions for the working population, they just never fundamentally change.
And what's fascinating here is that the speed of the rejection is itself evidence that the duopoly is failing.
It is. The consensus is failing because the material outcomes for the majority are so consistently negative and so immediate. People are just acutely sensitive now to the lack of any real economic improvement.
So we arrive at this pretty tragic conclusion the source puts forward.
Yeah.
The current political climate is definitely not a sign of a vibrant democracy in action.
No, not at all. It's the furthest thing from that.
It's not voters thoughtfully choosing between distinct paths.
That's the most sobering thought. Instead, what we're seeing is a trapped electorate frantically pulling the only two levers they have been given.
They're desperately searching for a solution to their shared economic problems, but the levers they pull are attached to the exact same engine.
An engine that's maintained by that shared neocon and neoliberal consensus.
So the machine just keeps running, humming along perfectly for those at the very top, while all this political volatility, the frantic whiplashing.
And just proof of the duopoly's failure to adapt to the needs of its people, not its strength. And that inability to adapt is what creates the opening for the kind of dramatic, personality-driven figures we see now.
Because they at least offer a rhetorical break from the consensus.
Even if the actual governance remains largely consistent on the core economic structure, yes.
So to summarize the key takeaway from this deep dive, the political volatility defining modern America isn't really about cultural polarization. That's the sideshow.
Right.
It is fundamentally a symptom of a shared governance by neocon and neoliberal frameworks that, despite all their verbal sparring, fail to address core economic realities. And that traps voters in this cycle of limited cosmetic choices every 4 years.
What stands out to me is how the sources compel us to see this not as a political argument, but as a system failure. And that raises the ultimate question about reform.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider as you process all this. If the electorate is only pulling the two levers they've been given, the red and the blue, which both lead to the same structural outcomes, what does that imply about the necessary scale of change that's required to genuinely alter that actual power structure the system is designed to protect?
I mean, if the duopoly is designed to absorb dissent without allowing fundamental policy shifts on wealth and war, then the solution has to involve changing the structure of the debate itself, not just swapping out the individuals who are currently running the consensus. The volatility is demanding that we look outside the box, but the question is, how do you even begin to build a new lever?